Clara Whitmore set her basket of bread on the market table, lifted her chin, and looked Aldean Forsyth directly in the eye, even as the woman's silk-gloved finger pointed at the mismatched stitching on her sleeve, and the laughter spread through 40 people like fire through dry grass. She did not flinch. She did not look down. She had mended that dress with her own hands after a 14-hour workday, and she would not apologize for it to anyone. But she did not expect what happened next, because that was the moment Ethan Calloway stepped out of the shadow of the fence post, and the entire market went silent. If you've ever been judged for something, you worked hard for Stay With Me until the end. Subscribe to the channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1881 sat heavy over Red Hollow, Montana, the kind of heat that dried out the creek beds and made the mountains shimmer like they were breathing. The annual market had drawn every family from 10 miles in every direction, the wagon wheels cutting deep ruts into the main road, the smell of wood smoke and baked bread and leather hanging in the thick air. Clara Whitmore had been awake since 4 in the morning. She had baked 6 loaves of bread, wrapped them in clean cloth, and placed them in her basket one by one. The bread was good. She knew that, even if she knew very little else with certainty these days. She had learned to bake from her mother, and her mother had learned from her mother before that, and there was something steady and dignified in continuing that line even when everything else in her life had come undone. She put on her dress, the blue cotton one, the only dress she owned that was fit to be seen in public. She had mended it so many times now that she had stopped counting the repairs. The left sleeve had a patch of slightly darker fabric where she had reinforced the seam 3 winters ago. The hem had been let out, then taken back in, then let out again as her circumstances shifted. There was a line of stitching along the right shoulder in cream-colored thread because she had run out of the blue. She had pressed it that morning with a flat iron heated over the fire, and she had pinned her hair back neatly. And she had looked at herself in the small cracked mirror above the wash basin and said aloud to herself, "You are going to hold your head up." She meant it when she said it. She walked the 1.5 miles to the market alone, the basket over her arm, her boots raising small puffs of dust with every step. Red Hollow was not a large town. There were perhaps 300 souls living within its boundaries, and most of them had known each other for going on 20 years. That meant they knew each other's histories, each other's failures, each other's soft places. And for Clara Whitmore, that kind of knowing had never been a kindness. She had grown up in Red Hollow. She had watched it change around her. She had watched certain families rise, the merchants, the bankers, the landowners, and she had watched others sink. Her own family had sunk. Her father had died when she was 14, leaving debts that took years to untangle. Her mother had died 3 winters back, leaving Clara alone in a rented room above the feed store with a sewing kit, a cast iron pot, and the knowledge of how to do just about everything with very little. She was 26 years old. She had never married. Not for lack of interest. Once upon a time, but that story belonged to another season of her life, and she had closed that chapter as cleanly as she knew how. She made her living mending clothes, baking for the families who could afford to pay a small amount for the service, and doing whatever honest work came her way. It was not much, but it was hers and she kept it clean. She reached the market as it was filling up. The main road had been laid out with tables and wagons, goods spread across every surface, bolts of cloth, tools, dried goods, jars of preserves, fresh vegetables, leather goods from the tanner 2 towns over. Children ran between the adults' legs. Somewhere near the far end, a man was playing a fiddle, the notes loose and cheerful in the summer air. Clara made her way to the small space, she said, at the end of one of the tables, the end, because the better spots cost money she didn't have, and she arranged her bread carefully and waited. She sold 2 loaves in the first hour. A young mother with a baby on her hip had bought one without looking at Clara's dress at all, which Clara appreciated more than the woman would ever know. An older man bought the second, tipping his hat and calling her miss with genuine courtesy. Then Mrs. Aldean Forsyth arrived. Algen Forsyth was the wife of Gerald Forsyth, who owned the largest dry goods store in Red Hollow and 3 more in towns to the east. She was not a cruel woman by nature, perhaps, but she had been wealthy long enough that she had forgotten how cruelty could land on a person. And she had a circle of women around her who competed for her approval by finding other people's flaws and naming them loudly. She came down the row of tables with 2 women beside her, all 3 of them in pale summer dresses that plump more than Clara earned in a month. She was not looking at Clara. She was talking about something, a visit she had made to her sister in Helena. And then she turned to examine the bread on the table, and her eyes traveled, naturally, from the bread to the hands that had made it, and from the hands upward to the dress. She stopped talking. The woman to her left noticed where she was looking. Then both of them were looking. Clara kept her expression still. She had learned that too, how to make her face into something quiet and neutral when she needed to endure being looked at. She didn't look away. She met Mrs. Forsyth's gaze steadily, the way her mother had taught her to meet things she couldn't change. "Is that supposed to be a dress?" Mrs. Forsyth said. She didn't say it to Clara, exactly. She said it the way people say things they want the world to hear while pretending they're only speaking to one person. "It looks," said the woman to her left, Margaret Hale, the bank manager's wife, "like something one might use to line a chicken coop." The third woman, Clara didn't know her name, didn't want to laugh outright. People nearby turned to look. That was the terrible arithmetic of public cruelty. It drew attention by design. It made a spectacle of its target, and the more people who turned, the smaller the person at the center was meant to feel. Clara pressed her hand flat on the table. She did not cry. She was not ashamed, but her hand pressed hard against that wood, because something had to absorb the impact of it, all of it, the laughter and the looking and the careful, deliberate loudness of what had just been said, and she had decided years ago that she would not let that impact reach her face. "I sewed it myself," Clara said. Her voice was level. "I reckon most of the work that matters doesn't come from a shop." Mrs. Forsyth raised one eyebrow. That was the expression she used when someone beneath her had said something unexpected. "Work," she repeated. The word in her mouth sounded faintly ridiculous, as though Clara had said something quaint. "Yes," Clara said. "Work." There was a small silence. Then Margaret Hale said with a practiced smile, "Well, it certainly shows." More laughter. Not everyone. There were people in that market who kept their eyes on their own goods and said nothing but enough. Enough that Clara could feel it pressing on her from several directions at once. She picked up her basket. She was going to leave. Not because she was ashamed, she told herself. Because there was no point. Because staying would give them more of what they wanted. Because her mother had told her that the most powerful thing a person could do in the face of cruelty was refuse to perform for it. She looped the basket over her arm, and then the market went quiet. Not the quiet of ordinary things. The specific quiet that falls over a crowd when something has shifted, when someone has walked into a space and the air has changed. Clara looked up. Ethan Calloway was standing 20 feet away. She had seen him before, the way everyone in Red Hollow had seen Ethan Calloway, at a distance mostly. He was the kind of man who existed at the edges of things. He came to town when he needed supplies. He conducted his business without lingering. He had been in Red Hollow for 7 years, bought his land in the mountains above the valley, built his operation up from almost nothing into something that other ranchers spoke about, with respect that was equal parts admiration and discomfort. He had land and livestock and men who worked for him, and he had no wife and no particular interest, as far as anyone could tell, in acquiring one. He was tall, the kind of tall that you noticed before anything else. Broad through the shoulders, with the particular build of a man who had done physical work his entire life and hadn't stopped. He wore a hat pushed back slightly, the brim shading his face, and a leather vest over spun shirt. There was a quiet about him that was different from shyness. It was the quiet of someone who had decided, at some point, that most things weren't worth speaking aloud. He had heard everything. Clara could see it in his face, not in any dramatic expression, because Ethan Calloway's face did not do dramatic expressions, but in the steadiness of his gaze, which was moving, slowly and deliberately, from Mrs. Forsyth to Margaret Hale to the third woman, to the people who had laughed, and there was something in that slow survey that made the laughter stop. Then he walked toward Clara, not quickly, not with any kind of performance. He walked the way he did everything, with a deliberateness that said he had decided what he was going to do and intended to do it. He stopped beside her. He reached back and unhooked his leather coat from where it hung over his arm. The good one, Clara realized, the one made from worked hide that probably cost $30 if it cost a cent, and he settled it around her shoulders. He did it the way you'd settle a coat around someone you'd known for years. Then he turned and looked at Mrs. Forsyth. Anyone who laughs at someone working honestly, he said, has forgotten what respect looks like. His voice was quiet. That was the thing about it. It wasn't raised, wasn't sharp, wasn't the performance of anger. It was just a statement, even and direct and unambiguous. Mrs. Forsyth opened her mouth, closed it. Ethan waited with the patience of a man who could outwait just about anything. She said nothing. Ethan looked at Clara. "Ma'am," he said. "You got more bread to sell?" Clara stared at him. She was aware, in a distant way, that her heart was doing something irregular. She was also aware that half the market was watching them. She was aware that the coat on her shoulders was heavy and warm and smelled of wood smoke and leather, and that no one had put a coat around her shoulders in longer than she could easily remember. "I have 4 loaves left," she said. "I'll take them," he said. For the hands. He reached into his pocket and set coins on the table without counting them out dramatically. He just set down what it was worth and a little extra, the way an honest man does. Clara looked at the coins. She looked at him. "That's too much," she said. "No, it isn't," he said. She had spent enough years being careful with money to know exactly what fair payment was, and she could see that he had overpaid. She could also see that arguing with him about it, in front of half the town, would achieve nothing. She wrapped the 4 remaining loaves. He took the package. He nodded to her a small courteous nod, the tip of his chin, and he walked away. The market noise gradually resumed. Not immediately, and not without a certain self-consciousness that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Forsyth departed with her companions without buying anything. Margaret Hale said something sharp and quiet to the woman beside her as they left. Clara didn't try to hear it. She stood for a moment with the coat still around her shoulders. It was too warm for a coat. It was July. The coat was unnecessary by any practical measure. She kept it on for 10 more minutes before she folded it carefully over her arm to carry back to him. She found him at the edge of the market, near where the wagons were tied. He was talking to another man, one of his ranch hands, she guessed, from the look of him, and the conversation ended as she approached. She held out the coat. "Thank you," she said, "but I can't keep it." He took the coat. He didn't argue. "What's your name?" he asked. "Clara Whitmore." "I know who you are," she said. "I figured." He settled the coat back over his arm. "You live in town above the feed store." He nodded slowly. Then, as if he were settling something in his own mind rather than asking her permission, "I need someone manage the kitchen at the ranch. Previous woman moved on last month. It's steady pay. Room included if you want it." Clara looked at him. She had fielded offers of charity before people who offered her things out of pity, with the particular light in their eyes that said they wanted to feel good about helping rather than that they actually saw her. She had turned down everyone. She had a deep and abiding reluctance to accept anything that came wrapped in pity. This didn't feel like that. It felt like a man who had a problem and had decided she might be the solution to it. "You don't know anything about my cooking," she said. "I just bought 4 loaves of bread," he said. "That's baking." Same principle. It isn't, actually. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one. "Can you cook?" he asked. "Better than anyone in this valley," she said. It wasn't boasting. It was simply true, and she had stopped pretending otherwise. "What are your terms?" he asked. That caught her. She hadn't expected him to put it that way, as though she had terms. As though she were a person with terms. She thought about it. "Fair wages," she said. "Paid on the 1st of every month in full without reduction for minor things. A room with a door that locks. Sunday afternoons free. And I am not charity. I earn my place or I leave it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Agreed," he said. "You can start Monday if you want. I'll need to settle my room in town." "Take the week." She nodded, he nodded. He picked up the package of bread from where he'd set it on the wagon board, checked that it was secure, and climbed up to the seat. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She looked up at him. "The stitching on that dress," he said. "The cream-colored thread on the shoulder. My mother used to say that the repairs a person makes tell you more about them than the original garment ever could." He clicked to the horses. The wagon moved. Clara stood in the dust of the departing wheel tracks and held very still for a moment, because her chest had done something unexpected and she needed a second to determine what it was. The week passed the way weeks do when a person is waiting for something slowly at first, then all at once. She settled her account with the feed store owner, who seemed genuinely sorry to lose a quiet tenant. She packed her few belongings into the single trunk that had been her mother's. She spent an afternoon walking the streets of Red Hollow because she had a feeling, though she couldn't have said why, that things were about to change in a way that meant this particular walk would become a memory. She saw Mrs. Forsythe twice during that week. The first time, Mrs. Forsythe looked through her as though she were air. The second time outside the general store, unavoidably close, Mrs. Forsythe met her eyes for just a moment, and something in the woman's expression shifted. Not an apology. Clara wasn't expecting that, but something. On Monday morning, she arrived at the Calloway Ranch before sunrise. The place was bigger than she had expected, not in a showy way, but in a working way. The kind of spread that had been built by actual labor over actual years. There were hands already moving in the corrals when she arrived, and a dog that came to investigate her at the gate, circling once, and then apparently deciding she was acceptable. The foreman, a stocky man named Dell, who had a face weathered down to its essential features, met her at the door to the main house and walked her through the kitchen, the pantry, the cold storage, and the outdoor cooking area that the hands used in summer. "Mr. Calloway said you'd be particular about how things are organized," Dell said, with a tone that was trying to be neutral about it. "That's accurate," Clara said. Dell scratched the back of his neck. "You want me to have the boys move anything?" "Not yet. I'll tell you by end of day what I need." Dell looked at her. "Yes, ma'am," he said, in the tone of a man revising his initial assessment. She spent the morning taking inventory. The pantry was disorganized, but stocked. Someone had bought supplies without any particular system, which meant things were lost behind other things, and certain staples had been overordered, while others were nearly gone. She made a list. She reorganized the shelves. She found a crock of lard that had gone rancid and disposed of it, and found a sack of flour that had been stored improperly and was beginning to turn. She disposed of that too. She made lunch for 11 men, a simple meal, nothing elaborate, designed to show her range rather than impress anyone with complexity. Biscuits, salt beef, a pan of gravy, pickled beets from the cellar. She had it on the table at noon. The men came in and ate. Several of them said nothing, which she had expected. Two of the younger ones offered genuine compliments. Dell ate 2 helpings of the biscuits and said, with great deliberateness, "These are good." Ethan Calloway ate at the far end of the table. He said nothing during the meal. When he was done, he set his fork down, pushed back his chair, and looked at her from across the table. "Those are the best biscuits I've eaten in 3 years," he said. "The flour in the pantry is fresh," she said. Someone was buying the wrong kind. "I'll let you order the supplies going forward," he said. "That would be efficient," she said. He stood up and put his hat back on and went back to work. Dell, who had been watching this exchange, turned to look at Clara with an expression of careful recalibration. Clara began clearing the table. She had been at the ranch 2 weeks when the talk started in town. She heard about it from Ruth Beckett, who ran the small laundry on the main street and who had always been decent to Clara in the straightforward way of a person who is too busy to bother with cruelty. Ruth mentioned it gently, the way you mention a thing to a friend that you'd rather not mention at all. "People are talking," Ruth said, "about you. And Mr. Calloway," Clara continued, folding the shirt in her hands. "What are they saying?" she asked. "That you went up there to trap him," Ruth said. "That after what he did at the market, you saw your opportunity." Clara set the shirt down. She had known it was coming. She had known it with the certainty of someone who has lived in a small town long enough to understand how small towns work. She had gone from invisible to visible in the space of one afternoon, and visibility in Red Hollow had a way of becoming a target. "What do you think?" Clara asked. Ruth looked at her directly. "I think you bake the best bread in the county, and you needed a steady situation, and you took an honest job. And I think people with too much time talk too much." Clara nodded. "Thank you, Ruth. I'm not telling you to be careful," Ruth said. "I know you're already careful. I'm just telling you so you're not surprised if it gets worse before it gets better." Clara rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, the light turning the mountains gold. She thought about what Ruth had said. She thought about what it would mean, the talking, the speculation, the way people were building a story about her, out of their own assumptions. She had not come to the Calloway Ranch to trap anyone. She had come because she had been offered fair wages for honest work, and because the alternative was continuing as she had been mending other people's clothes in a room above a feed store and feeling, with increasing clarity, that her life was contracting rather than expanding. She had not come for Ethan Calloway, but she had noticed things. She noticed that he treated everyone on his property with the same even courtesy: the hands, the horses, the dog, and now her. She noticed that he worked the same hours his men worked, not longer for show, but not shorter for status either. She noticed that when one of the younger hands made a mistake that cost a day's work, Ethan didn't raise his voice. He asked the man to walk him through what had happened, and then told him, clearly and without drama, what to do differently. She noticed that he read in the evenings actual books, not just the newspaper. She noticed that sometimes, when she was cleaning up after supper, and the sound of the men had moved outside and the kitchen was quiet, she could hear him in the next room turning pages. And the sound of it was unexpectedly comforting, in the way that proof of another person's inner life can be comforting when you have spent a long time feeling like the only person in your world who had one. She told herself she was noticing these things the way she noticed everything, practically, analytically, because understanding a place and the people in it was how you did your job well. She was mostly convincing. The trouble arrived on a Thursday. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard a horse come into the yard at a pace too quick for a routine arrival. She heard Dell's voice, then another voice she didn't recognize, flatter, more official in its cadence. Then Ethan's voice, quieter than the others, but somehow more present. She didn't go to the window. It wasn't her business. But she strained to hear, because something in the quality of the voices told her it was important. 20 minutes later, Ethan came into the kitchen. He stood for a moment without speaking, which she had come to recognize as his way of organizing his thoughts, before he put them into words. "Do you know a man named Aldous Crane?" he asked. Clara set down the bowl she was holding. She knew that name. She knew it the way you know the name of the person who has done you irreparable harm, not with anger, not anymore, but with a bone-deep recognition. "Yes," she said. "He's filed a claim," Ethan said, "on a parcel land east of town. Strip that runs along the creek bed." Clara looked at him. That land, she said slowly, belonged to my father. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. Tell me, he said. She pulled out a chair and sat down. She had carried this story for 12 years, and she had never told it to anyone who had the power to do anything about it. She had told Ruth once in pieces. She had told no one else. She told Ethan Calloway. She told him about her father's land, 30 acres along the eastern creek, good land, the kind that held water through the dry months. She told him how her father had borrowed money from a man named Crane to get through the second year of drought, when the cattle losses had been severe. She told him how the loan papers had been written in language that her father, who had not had much schooling, hadn't fully understood. She told him how, the winter after her father died, Crane had come with documents that he said proved the land had been pledged as collateral, documents that her father had never described to her, documents that her father had never mentioned, documents that a 12-year-old girl had no way to contest. And the land? He took it, Clara said. The following spring. And you never saw the original papers? No. Did you have anything, any record your father kept? Clara was quiet for a moment. My father kept a ledger, she said. He wrote everything down, every transaction, every debt, every payment. He was careful about records even when he wasn't careful about other things. She paused. I have it. I've always had it. I took it when he died, and I've carried it through every room I've lived in since. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Get it, he said. What? Get the ledger. When you have time. Why? Because Aldous Crane is trying to file a claim on land that has a 12-year history, he said. And a ledger kept by the previous owner, showing payments made and debts recorded, is the kind of document a territorial judge takes seriously. Clara's heart had started doing something complicated. You can't take on Aldous Crane, she said. He has money and connections, and I have both of those things too, Ethan said, without any particular pride. Just stating a fact. And I have a lawyer in Helena who handles exactly this kind of matter. This isn't your fight, she said. He looked at her directly. A man filed a false claim on land that was stolen from a 12-year-old girl. And now that girl is sitting in my kitchen, and I am apparently a man who gets involved in such things. Clara stared at him. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the counter. Supper at the usual time, he asked. Yes, she said, because it was the only word she could locate. Good, he said, and went back outside. Clara sat in the kitchen for a while after he left, listening to the sounds of the ranch resuming around her, the horses, the distant voices of the men, the dog barking once at something at the gate. Then she got up and started on supper, because that was the job, and because doing the job was how she held herself together when everything else was moving in directions she hadn't anticipated. But her hands weren't shaking anymore. They had stopped shaking the moment he said, "Get the ledger." She didn't examine that too closely, not yet. That evening, after supper, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was clean, and the night had settled into its full depth around the ranch, Clara sat at the kitchen table with her mother's trunk open beside her and her father's ledger in her hands. She hadn't opened it in years. The cover was worn soft. Her father's handwriting covered every page in the careful, deliberate script of a man who had taught himself to write and took it seriously. Dates, amounts, names. She turned to the year of the loan. There it was. Borrowed of A. Crane $40, against expectation of sale of spring cattle. Terms: repayment by October or settlement in goods. No land pledged. No land discussed. Her father had written it in his careful hand. No land pledged. Clara pressed her thumb gently over the words, the way you touch something precious to make sure it's real. Then she heard a knock at the kitchen door frame. Ethan was standing there with 2 cups of coffee, which surprised her, because she had never seen him make coffee in the evening. Thought you might be at that, he said, nodding at the ledger. He set 1 cup on the table near her hand. He didn't sit down uninvited. He waited. She turned the ledger to face him and pointed to her father's words. He leaned over and read them. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, that's what we need. Will it be enough? I don't know yet. But it's the beginning of enough. He straightened. Don't lose that. I've carried it through 11 rooms, she said. I'm not likely to lose it now. He picked up his own cup. Stood there for a moment in the kitchen doorway, in the lamplight, with the sound of the summer night coming in through the window. Your father, he said, he was careful. He was, she said. He was careful about everything that mattered. He just couldn't always afford to fight for what he'd been careful about. Ethan was quiet. His daughter can, he said. He went back to his reading. Clara sat with the ledger and the coffee, and the words her father had written 20 years ago, and she thought about fighting for things. She thought she might be learning how. The next morning, Clara was at the stove before anyone else in the house was awake. That was deliberate. She had learned, in the years of making her way through other people's spaces, that the best thing a person could do in an unfamiliar place was establish usefulness before anyone had a chance to question her presence. Be there before they arrived. Have the coffee made. Have the fire going. Give them nothing to object to because you were already ahead of them. She had the biscuits in the oven and the coffee on and the salt pork sliced, and in the pan when she heard the first boots on the porch dell, always first. With the particular heavy-footed tread of a man who moved through the world as though he was trying to leave a dent in it. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the stove and then at Clara. You been up long? He asked. Long enough, she said. He poured himself a coffee without asking, which she took as a reasonable sign of comfort, and stood at the window with it. You know, Dell said, after a moment, the woman before you, Mrs. Holt, she used to make breakfast at 7:30. We ate at 8. I can do 7:30 if that's what suits the men, Clara said. The men, Dell said, are eating better than they have in 4 months. They'll eat at whatever hour you set the table. Clara turned the pork in the pan. Then we'll keep to 6, she said. Men work better on a full stomach, and a full stomach takes time to settle. Dell looked at her sideways. You always talk like that? Like what? Like you already know how everything works. She considered that. I know how a lot of things work, she said. I learned the hard way most of it. People who learn things the hard way tend to sound certain because they can't afford to be wrong twice. Dell was quiet for a moment. Fair enough, he said. The other men came in by ones and twos. They were a mixed lot, 2 older hands who had worked for Ethan since the early years, 3 younger men who had come on in the spring, a quiet man named George who seemed to do everything with the minimum possible conversation, and a boy of about 16 named Billy Marsh, who was apparently doing his first real season of ranch work and was still at the stage of watching everything twice to make sure he'd understood it right. Ethan came in last. He sat at the end of the table. He ate with the same economy of motion that characterized everything he did efficiently, without drama, paying attention to his food the way a man does when he genuinely appreciates it, rather than when he's performing appreciation. He didn't speak during breakfast, except to ask George about the north pasture fence. George said 3 posts needed replacement. Ethan said to get to it today before the heat built. George nodded. That was the whole conversation. Clara refilled the coffee around the table. When she got to Ethan, he put his hand over his cup. Already had 2, he said. Any more and I won't be fit company. Billy Marsh, the boy, looked up with an expression of mild surprise, as though he had not expected Ethan Calloway to say anything resembling a joke. Neither had Clara, honestly. She moved on around the table. She was aware that Dell was watching her with the particular attention of a man who was recalibrating something. She didn't know what yet, but she had learned to pay attention to that kind of watching. After the men cleared out, she began on the dishes. She heard Ethan pause in the doorway. Clara. She turned. Dell's going to town this afternoon for supplies. I've authorized you to give him a list for the pantry, whatever you need. Have it ready by noon. I already have one written, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Of course you do, he said. He put his hat on and went out to the horses. Clara scrubbed a plate and told herself firmly that the corner of her mouth was not doing what she thought it was doing. The list she gave Dell was thorough and precise, annotated with notes about quantity and quality, the kind of flour she needed, the grade of salt, the specific variety of dried beans that cooked fastest and held their shape. She had written it the night before, after Ethan had gone back to his reading, and she had sat at the kitchen table long enough to understand what she was working with. Dell looked at the list for a long time. This is very detailed, he said. Yes, she said. You written down the exact store you want this flour from. The other one mills it too fine. It doesn't hold structure in biscuits. Dell folded the list and put it in his shirt pocket. He looked like a man who had opinions he was choosing not to share, which Clara respected. I'll be back by 4, he said. He was back by 3:30. He set everything on the kitchen table and stood back, and Clara unpacked it and checked it against the list, item by item. Everything was there. Everything was correct. She looked up at Dell. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Dell said. I read every item twice in the store to make sure I didn't come back wrong. You got a particular look when something isn't right, and I wasn't looking forward to it. Clara paused. What kind of look, she asked. The kind that doesn't need to say anything, Dell said. He left before she could respond. She stood in the kitchen with the supplies around her and felt, for the first time in longer than she could name, something that she cautiously identified as belonging to a place. She put it away carefully, like a thing that might break. 9 days into her time at the ranch, she came back from the garden with a basket of herbs and found Billy Marsh sitting on the back step with his face arranged in the specific configuration of a young man trying not to cry and failing moderately. She sat down on the step beside him. She didn't ask what was wrong. She had learned that asking what was wrong, directly, often made it harder for people to say. Instead, she set the basket down and began sorting through the herbs, which gave Billy something to look at other than her face. After a while, he said, Dell told me I did the fence wrong. Did you? I reckon. The posts are in, but they're not set deep enough. A good wind'll take them. Then you'll reset them, she said. He said it in front of everyone. Clara continued sorting herbs. That stings, she said, being corrected in front of people. Worse than the work, Billy said. It usually is. She tied a bundle of thyme with a bit of twine. Did Dell know you were new when he put you on the fence? Yes, ma'am. Then that's on him as much as you, she said. A good foreman checks the work of a new hand before the whole job's done, not after. You remember what you did wrong. That's all that matters now. Billy was quiet for a moment. Mr. Calloway's going to think I'm useless. Has Mr. Calloway said that? No, ma'am. Then don't put words in his mouth, she said. He strikes me as a man who forms his own opinions on his own schedule. Give him something worth forming an opinion about. Billy looked at her. He had the wide-open face of a boy who hadn't yet learned to guard his expressions, which Clara found she appreciated. You talk straight, he said. I don't have time to talk crooked, she said. Go fix the fence. He went. She went inside and found Ethan standing at the kitchen counter, who had apparently come in through the front and heard the last half of the conversation. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. The boy needed someone to tell him what was true, she said, before he could speak. I know, Ethan said. I was going to say you handled it well. Clara put the herbs on the counter and didn't answer that, because she wasn't sure what to do with the way he'd said it. The first real trouble came on a Thursday afternoon, 16 days into her time at the ranch, and it came from a direction she hadn't expected. She was hanging laundry in the side yard when she heard a wagon coming up the road. Visitors to the ranch weren't unusual suppliers, neighboring ranchers, the occasional territorial official, but something about the speed of this one made her turn and look. It was Gerald Forsyth, not his wife. Gerald himself, in a good wagon with a hired driver, wearing his town clothes and his merchant's expression, which was the particular expression of a man who has decided in advance that a conversation will go his way. He stepped down from the wagon and looked around the yard as though assessing inventory. Then he saw Clara. Something crossed his face. She couldn't tell if it was surprise or confirmation of something he'd already suspected. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Forsyth," she said. "Is Calloway here?" "I'll let him know you've arrived," she said. She kept her voice level and her feet still. She was not going to scramble. She was not going to look like a woman who had been caught at something. She went inside and found Dell and told him, and Dell went and found Ethan. Ethan came out with his hat on and his expression at its most unreadable, which she was beginning to understand was how he looked when he was paying close attention. She went back to the laundry because it was her job, and walking away from her job because a powerful man had arrived would look exactly like what she wasn't. But she could hear. "Calloway," Forsyth said. His voice carried the particular authority of a man who has spent years making pronouncements and having them received. "I'll be direct. There's talk in town about your new arrangement." "I've hired a cook and housekeeper," Ethan said. "If you've come from town to tell me about talk, I'm not sure that's the best use of your Thursday." "The woman has a reputation." A pause. Clara's hands on the laundry went still. "She has a reputation," Ethan said, and his voice had not changed volume or temperature at all, "for making the best biscuits in the valley, for keeping an honest account of her work, and for not bothering people who don't bother her." "If that's the reputation you're referring to, then yes." "She does." Another pause. "You know what I mean," Forsyth said, and something in his voice had recalibrated slightly. "I know what you think you mean," Ethan said. "I'm going to ask you to think more carefully about what you're implying and whether you want to have said it." A long silence. Clara breathed. "The town is concerned," Forsyth said, in a different register, now more careful, less declarative. "The town," Ethan said, "is not my employer. Miss Whitmore is employed at this ranch in a professional capacity. She is good at her job. She conducts herself with more dignity than most people in this valley manage on their best days." And I have no further comment on the matter. She heard Forsyth say something low, something she couldn't catch. Then she heard Ethan say, clearly, and without particular emphasis, "Gerald, I've bought cattle from you for 6 years, and I expect I'll buy them for 6 more. Don't make that a harder relationship than it needs to be." The wagon left 20 minutes later. Clara finished hanging the laundry. When she came inside, Ethan was at the table with a cup of coffee, looking at something in a leather-bound ledger of his own ranch accounts, she supposed. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. After a moment she went to start on supper, because the day continued and the men would be hungry, and the world moved forward whether people said the right things to each other or not. But something had shifted. She could feel it the way you feel a change in the air before weather comes in. She had been at the ranch 3 weeks when Ruth Beckett arrived. Ruth had driven herself out in her own small wagon, which she did sometimes when she needed supplies from the ranches or had laundry business with the hands. She came into the kitchen with the straightforward energy of a woman on a schedule and accepted coffee and a biscuit, and then said, without any particular preamble, "It's getting worse." Clara set her own cup down. "Tell me." Aldous Crane was at the general store 2 days ago. He was talking not quietly about how Ethan Calloway had brought a woman of questionable character onto his property, and how that said something about the kind of man Calloway was becoming. Clara felt something cold move through her. He said that. Loud enough for 4 people to hear and repeat it. And you know how repetition works. What did people say? "Mixed," Ruth said. "There are people in this town who know better. Mrs. Prentice said outright that she'd seen you work since you were 15 years old, and that anyone calling you questionable hadn't looked at the things. Old Thomas from the hardware said much the same. But Crane's got friends, Clara." Men who owe him money have a way of becoming loyal real fast. Clara was quiet for a moment. Why is Crane doing this now, she asked. He's had 12 years. Why file the claim now and why come after me at the same time? Ruth looked at her carefully. You really don't know. Tell me. Because you're at the Calloway Ranch, Ruth said. Because before, you were a woman alone with a ledger and no one to help you use it. And now you're somewhere with resources behind you. Crane knows it. He's trying to discredit you before you can use what you have. The room went very quiet. Clara heard that, truly heard it, and felt the pieces of it settling into place with the cold, specific clarity of something she should have seen sooner. Crane wasn't just filing a land claim. He was trying to destroy her credibility before she could destroy his. She stood up. Thank you, Ruth, she said. What are you going to do? I need to talk to Ethan, she said. Ruth looked at her, really looked at her with the kind of expression that a woman uses when she sees something in another woman's face that she wants to name but knows better than to. Be careful, Ruth said, not as a warning about Crane. As something more complicated. I'm always careful, Clara said. Ruth left. Clara went to find Ethan. She found him at the corral, working with a horse that had apparently decided it wasn't particularly interested in being worked with. She stood at the fence and waited because interrupting a man in the middle of that particular conversations seemed unwise. After a few minutes, the horse relented on some interior negotiation, and Ethan handed it off to one of the hands and came to the fence. He looked at her face. What happened, he said. She told him. All of it, what Ruth had said, what Crane was doing, the shape of it, the way the timing made sense now that she could see it. Ethan listened without interrupting. That was one of the things about him she had noticed from the beginning. He let people finish before he responded, which was rarer than it should be. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. He's afraid of the ledger, Ethan said.
Yes.
Which means the ledger can hurt him.
Yes.
Then we stop waiting, Ethan said. I'll write to my lawyer in Helena today. I want him to see the ledger and tell us what we're working with legally before Crane has a chance to bury this in paperwork. I'll get the ledger tonight, she said. He nodded. Then he said, You should know what he's saying about you in town. I don't believe a word of it. Clara looked at him directly. I know that, she said. I want you to know I know it, he said. There's a difference. She held his gaze for a moment longer than she needed to. Yes, she said. There is. She went back to the kitchen. She told herself, with great firmness, that the warmth in her chest was righteous anger about Aldous Crane, and absolutely nothing else. She almost believed it. The lawyer's name was Harlan Briggs, and he arrived from Helena 11 days later faster than Clara had expected, which told her something about how seriously Ethan had written the letter. He was a small man with precise movements and a way of looking at documents that reminded Clara of a man reading music line by line, with an almost physical pleasure in what the notation contained. He sat at the kitchen table with her father's ledger in front of him for 40 minutes. She sat across from him. Ethan sat at the far end, not reading, not speaking, with the quality of stillness that was his natural state. Briggs turned the final page. He went back to the entry Clara had shown Ethan. No land pledged. No land discussed, and read it 3 more times. This is your father's handwriting, he said. Yes. And you have no other samples to verify? I have 20 years of ledger entries in the same hand, she said. And I have letters he wrote to my mother before they married. And I have a promissory note he signed with a man in Billings in 869 that I've kept in the same trunk. Briggs looked up. You've kept all of that, he said. I kept everything, she said. I didn't know which piece would matter. Harlan Briggs looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been in his profession long enough to recognize something uncommon. Miss Whitmore, he said, do you know what you have here? Tell me what I have, she said, because she wanted to hear him say it. You have a contemporaneous record, in the hand of the borrower, explicitly stating that no land was pledged as collateral in the transaction with Aldous Crane. You have it dated, signed with initials, and recorded among a consistent series of entries that establish the ledger as a reliable account of transactions, rather than a document created after the fact. He set the ledger down gently. Crane's claim rests on documents he produced after your father's death. A judge who sees both sets of records will have to choose between a dead man's careful ledger and a living man's post-mortem paperwork. Will a judge take the case? Ethan asked from the end of the table. The territorial judge in Helena hears land disputes quarterly, Briggs said. The next session is in 8 weeks. I think we can get this on the docket. 8 weeks. Clara looked at the ledger. She thought about her father sitting at whatever table he'd sat at, writing in his careful hand, recording things faithfully, because he believed that records mattered. She thought about how he had died, before he could use what he'd written to protect what he'd built. She thought he was keeping it for me. He just didn't know it yet. File it, she said. Briggs looked at Ethan. Miss Whitmore is the plaintiff, Ethan said simply. She doesn't need my agreement. Briggs turned back to Clara. Filed, he said. That evening, Clara made supper in the particular deliberate way she did when something was occupying a large amount of her interior space efficiently, without variation. Because cooking from muscle memory freed the rest of her mind for the thing she actually needed to be thinking about. The thing she needed to be thinking about was what 8 weeks looked like. 8 weeks of Aldous Crane knowing that she had filed. 8 weeks of him talking. 8 weeks the town forming opinions, and Ethan's reputation being tested, and her own name being used as a weapon against both of them. She was not afraid of the outcome. She had the ledger, and Briggs had said what he'd said with the certainty of a man who did not overstate. But she was afraid of the cost, not to herself. She had paid costs her entire life. She was practiced at it. She was afraid of the cost to Ethan. He had not asked to be in the middle of this. He had offered her a job and then proceeded to involve himself in her fight with a decisiveness that she found both deeply comforting and troubling in equal measure, because she had not asked for rescue. She did not want rescue. She wanted what was right, and she wanted to be the one standing on her own ground when she got it. She was still working through where Ethan Calloway fit in that picture when he came in for supper and sat down and ate and talked with the men the way he always did, and afterward brought his plate to the kitchen himself. He always did that. She had noticed always cleared his own place while the other men left theirs and set it in the basin. He didn't leave. He stood there for a moment. You've been quiet all evening, he said. I've been thinking, she said. About the case? About what it cost, she said. Not to me. A pause. Let me worry about what it cost me, he said. Ethan. She turned from the basin to look at him directly, which she had learned was the only way to have a real conversation with a man like him fully, without hedging. People are already talking. Crane is making it worse on purpose. And you have a business and a reputation in this valley, that. Clara, his voice wasn't sharp. Just certain. I've been in this valley 7 years. I know what my reputation is and what it isn't, and I'm not particularly worried about what Aldous Crane says about it. I've known men like him my whole life. They make noise because they're afraid of what'll happen when the noise stops. She looked at him. Why are you doing this? She said. The question had been in her for weeks. She was tired of not asking it. He thought about it for a moment, really thought. The way he did when he was being honest rather than convenient. Because it's right, he said. And he stopped. Started again. Because I have spent the last 7 years on this ranch building things, and keeping to myself and telling myself that was enough. And then I walked into a market and saw a woman hold herself together while people tried to pull her apart, and it reminded me that there are things worth getting off the fence for. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara held his gaze. I don't need you to fight my battles, she said. I know that, he said. I'm not fighting them. I'm standing next to you while you fight yours. There's a difference. There was. There was a difference, and she knew it. And the fact that he knew it too was the most unsettling thing he had said to her since the day at the market. "All right," she said, finally. "All right," he said. He went back to his reading. Clara finished the dishes. Outside, the summer night had deepened around the ranch, the mountains solid and dark against the sky, the stars coming out one by one in the way they do in high country, not gradually, but with sudden intensity, as though someone had been holding them back and finally let go. She dried her hands on the kitchen cloth and stood at the window for a moment. She thought about her father's ledger. She thought about 8 weeks. She thought about Aldous Crane's face when the truth finally landed in front of a judge who had no stake in keeping it buried. She thought about a man who understood the difference between fighting a battle and standing beside someone who was fighting their own. Then she turned out the kitchen lamp and went to bed. She did not sleep immediately, but for the first time in a very long time, what kept her awake was not worry. It was something else entirely. Something she hadn't felt in so long she had almost forgotten it had a name. The letter arrived on a Monday. Clara knew it was bad before she opened it, the way you know certain things not from evidence, but from the specific quality of the silence that surrounds them. Dell had brought the mail in from town and sat on the kitchen table without his usual commentary, which meant he had looked at the return address and decided he didn't want to be in the room when she read it. She picked it up. Aldous Crane, written in a lawyer's hand, not his own. He had hired someone to write it, which meant he was taking this seriously enough to spend money on it. She read it standing at the counter. The letter was addressed not to her but to Ethan Calloway, care of his ranch. It informed Mr. Calloway, in the precise language of legal intimidation, that by employing a woman of disputed character and known association with fraudulent land claims, he had potentially implicated himself in a conspiracy to obstruct a legitimate property dispute. It suggested that Mr. Calloway would be well advised to reconsider his current domestic arrangements. It was signed by a lawyer named Prescott, with an office in Billings. Clara set the letter down. She stood very still for a moment. Then she picked it up again and read the phrase "known association with fraudulent land claims" one more time, to make sure she had understood it correctly. He wasn't just going after the land. He was going after Ethan. She walked to the door and called for Dell. Dell appeared with the expression of a man who had been waiting nearby and was not particularly surprised to have been called. "Where is Ethan?" she said. "North pasture," Dell said. "He'll be back by noon. When he gets back," Clara said, "tell him I need to speak with him. Tell him it's important." Dell looked at the letter in her hand. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She went back to the kitchen and made bread, because there were things that needed doing, and standing still waiting for noon would accomplish nothing. She worked the dough with more force than was technically required, which she recognized as a physical expression of something that didn't have a more constructive outlet. Ethan came in at 11:40. She heard his boots on the porch. She heard him say something to Dell, and heard Dell's response, and then the door opened, and he came into the kitchen and looked at her face, and then at the letter on the table. He picked it up. He read it. She watched his face while he read. It didn't change. That was the thing about Ethan. The thing she had come to understand was not coldness but control. The discipline of a man who had learned that an unguarded face gave other people too much to use against him. He set the letter down. "Prescott," he said. "I know that name." "He's Crane's man in Billings?" "He's been Crane's man for years." Ethan's voice was flat and specific in the way it got when something had settled into focus for him. "He handled the Delaney property claim 3 years ago, east of here. Family lost 40 acres. Clara stared at him. "The Delaneys lost their land?" "To Crane." He looked at her. "He has a system, Clara." This isn't the first time. The room shifted. She felt it the way you feel the ground move, not dramatically, not like falling, but the specific wrongness of solid earth deciding it isn't. "He's done this before," she said. "More than once, I think." He pulled out a chair and sat down, which was something she had never seen him do in the kitchen during working hours. It meant he was settling in for a conversation, not managing one on his way somewhere else. I didn't connect it before, because Crane's careful. Every claim is slightly different. Different families, different paperwork, different angles. But the shape of it is the same: find a property with a vulnerability, manufacture a debt or a lien, wait for the right moment to file. The right moment, Clara said slowly, being when the person who could contest it has no resources to do so. Exactly. And now that I have resources, he's changed the approach, Ethan said. He's not just trying to win the land claim, he's trying to discredit both of us, so that anything we bring to a judge looks like the word of two people with an agenda against him. Clara pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. This was new. She had spent 12 years thinking about what Crane had done to her family. She had never thought about who else he had done it to. She had never had the information to think that way. The Delanys, she said. Are they still in the area? Daughter is. Margaret Delaney. She married a man named Holt, and they farm out past the South Ridge. Something stirred in Clara's memory. Holt. Dell mentioned a Mrs. Holt, the woman who worked here before me. Ethan looked at her. Yes. She left. She moved on, he said, after her husband's health got bad. They needed to be closer to family. Clara thought for a moment. Could you find her? Could Briggs find her? What are you thinking? I'm thinking, Clara said carefully, that if Crane has done this before, there are other ledgers. Other records. Other families who kept their own accounts, because honest people do that. They write things down because they believe records matter. She pressed her hand flat on the table. One woman and one ledger is a dispute. Two families and two ledgers is a pattern. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. She could see the exact moment it landed for him. A pattern, he said, is fraud, she said. And fraud in territorial land claims is a federal matter. It doesn't go to a county judge, it goes higher. The kitchen was very quiet. I'll write to Briggs today, Ethan said. Write to him about the Delanys. And ask him if there are others. Court records are public. He can look for other claims Prescott has handled in the last 15 years and see if any of them look like ours. Ethan stood up. He picked up the letter from Crane, folded it, and put it in his vest pocket. He sent this to scare us off, he said. I know. It had the opposite effect. I know that too, she said. He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a real smile she had seen from him, and it was gone quickly, but she had seen it. He went to write the letter. Clara went back to her bread. 3 days later, Dell came back from town with supplies, and a look on his face that Clara had learned to read, the look of a man carrying information he hadn't decided how to deliver. She took the supplies. She let him settle. She waited. Finally, at the kitchen table, over coffee, Dell said, Crane was at the bank yesterday. Whose bank? Forsyth's man. Not the bank itself, the back room. Him and Forsyth and Prescott. Dell turned his cup in his hands. George saw them go in. Separate entrances about 10 minutes apart. Clara set her cup down. Gerald Forsyth, the man whose wife had pointed at her dress in the market. The man who had come to the ranch to warn Ethan. The man Ethan had described as a 6-year business relationship he didn't want to complicate. Are Forsyth and Crane connected? She asked. I don't know, Dell said. But men who meet in back rooms with separate entrances aren't having innocent conversations. She thought about this. She thought about Forsyth coming to the ranch, the specific things he had said, the way he had said them, the pressure behind his words. She had read it at the time as a powerful man protecting his town's social order. She was reading it differently now. Dell, she said. Does Forsyth have land east of town? Dell looked at her. He's been trying to buy the creek parcel for 2 years. The one Crane filed on. There it was. She felt it settle into place with the cold, specific clarity of a thing she should have seen sooner. Crane filed the fraudulent claim. Forsyth bought the land from Crane once the original owner was removed. Crane and Prescott took their payment. Forsyth got what he wanted, and the family in between lost everything and had nowhere to go. It wasn't just Crane. It had never been just Crane. "Don't say anything to anyone yet," she told Dell. "Wasn't planning to," Dell said. She needed to talk to Ethan. She found him at the stables, which was where he went when he needed to think about something. She had figured that out in her first week, the way she figured out most things about the people around her. By watching what they did when they thought no one was paying attention. She told him what Dell had said. She watched his face. She watched the moment it hit him, not in any dramatic expression, but in a very small tightening around his jaw, the specific physical response of a man being told something he suspected and was hoping wasn't true. "Forsyth," he said. "It would explain why Crane moved now," she said. "Forsyth's been trying to buy that land for 2 years and getting nowhere. Crane files a fraudulent claim, the land changes hands through the courts, and Forsyth acquires it from Crane at a private price. Clean, legal on its surface, and impossible to trace unless you know what you're looking at. Gerald Forsyth has done business honestly for 20 years, Ethan said. And one dishonest transaction would give Crane leverage over him for the rest of his life, Clara said. I'm not saying Forsyth is a bad man. I'm saying a bad man found his weak point and used it. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. She watched him work through it, the 6 years of business, the relationship, the complicated arithmetic of what this meant and what it would cost, and what the right thing to do about it was. We have to tell Briggs, he said finally. Yes, and the Forsyth piece that has to be handled carefully. If we're wrong, I know, she said, we need more than Dell's account of who went in a back door. We need something that connects Forsyth directly to Crane's claim. She paused. Harlan Briggs is good at finding those connections. Ethan looked at her. How do you know so much about how this works, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question asked with the directness that was his natural mode. I've had 12 years to think about it, she said. When you lose something and you can't get it back, you spend a long time trying to understand exactly how you lost it. So that if you ever got a second chance, you'd know what to do. He held her gaze. This is your second chance, he said. Yes, she said, and I intend to use it correctly. Briggs arrived from Helena 6 days before the scheduled court session, which gave him less time than any of them wanted, and more urgency than any of them were comfortable with. He brought papers. A lot of papers. He spread them across the kitchen table, the only large flat surface in the house, and walked Clara and Ethan through what he had found. 5 land claims. Over 17 years. Different families, different locations, all within a 2-county radius of Red Hollow. All handled through Prescott's office. All involving the same pattern, a debt instrument produced after the death or incapacitation of the original property owner, paperwork that postdated the claim transaction, a rapid legal filing before the family could organize a response. The Delannys are willing to testify, Briggs said. Margaret Holt née Delaney has her own records. Her father kept accounts the same way yours did. He looked at Clara. 2 families with contemporaneous records, contradicting Crane's documents, changes this substantially. How substantially? Ethan asked. Substantially enough that I've written to the Federal Land Office, Briggs said. This isn't a single disputed claim anymore. This is a pattern of fraud in territorial land transactions. The Federal Land Office has jurisdiction, and they have considerably more appetite for this kind of case than a county judge. Clara felt something shift in her chest. Federal, not a county court where Crane might have connections, where Forsyth's money might carry weight in the selection of who presided, where the outcome could be shaped by local power. Federal meant none of that mattered. When? She asked. The Federal Land Commissioner's office has agreed to send an investigator, Briggs said. He arrives in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, she looked at Ethan. He was looking at the papers spread across the table. 5 families, 17 years, the careful and deliberate shape of what Crane had built. There's more, Briggs said. He reached into his leather case and produced one more document. I found a deed transfer, he said. Recorded 6 months ago in the county records in Billings. A parcel of land 32 acres along the Eastern Creek transferred from Aldous Crane to Gerald Forsyth. For a consideration of $1, the room was absolutely silent. $1. A land transfer for $1 was not a sale. It was an agreement of formalization of something that had already been decided, already been promised. It was a record of a deal that had been made before the land had been legally obtained. Which meant Forsyth hadn't just benefited from Crane's fraud. He had known about it before it happened. Clara looked at that document for a long time. She thought about Gerald Forsyth standing in this yard, warning Ethan about her. She thought about Mrs. Forsyth at the market, the silk gloves, the pointed finger, the deliberate loudness of "Is that supposed to be a dress?" She thought about the specific cruelty of being told, in front of an audience, that you were less than the people looking at you. She thought about her father's careful handwriting, no land pledged. No land discussed. Her father had been right. He had always been right. He just hadn't lived long enough to prove it. File everything, she said. Her voice was steady. It was the steadiest her voice had been in 12 years. Briggs nodded. Ethan looked at her from across the table. She didn't look back at him immediately. She kept her eyes on the papers for a moment longer, because she was holding something very large inside her chest, and she needed another second before she trusted her face. Then she looked up, and he was watching she had not seen from him before, something unguarded, something that existed in the space before he had a chance to compose it. And what it contained was not pity and not admiration, and not the complicated calculation of a man assessing a situation. It was something simpler than all of those. She looked away before she could name it. The news moved through Red Hollow the way news always moved through small towns, faster than it should and in slightly distorted form, picking up additions and interpretations at every door it passed through. By Friday, people knew the federal land office was involved. By Saturday, they knew there were multiple families. By Sunday, the name Forsyth was attached to the story, and that was when things changed in a way Clara felt in her bones, the specific change that happens when a powerful man's reputation is in question, and the people who had depended on his goodwill start to quietly reassess. She went to town on Monday. She had not been to town in 3 weeks, which had been deliberate. She had no desire to give the gossip any material to work with. But Briggs needed her signature on the federal complaint documents, and she was not going to send someone else to do it. She drove herself in the small wagon. She was aware that people looked at her differently. Not all of them. Ruth Beckett waved from across the street with a warmth that Clara felt. Old Thomas from the hardware tipped his hat with the specific respect of a man who has decided something and wanted her to know it. 2 other women she recognized from church nodded to her with a courtesy that hadn't been there before. But there were other looks too. The town was recalibrating, and recalibration was an uncomfortable process, and uncomfortable people looked for somewhere to put it. She signed Briggs's documents in his temporary office above the assay office. She was on her way back to the wagon when she heard her name. She stopped. Aldous Crane was standing 20 feet away. She had never actually been close to him before. She had a child's memory of him, large, prosperous, certain of himself. The man in front of her was older, but the certainty was intact. More than intact. It was the certainty of a man who had spent 17 years getting away with things, and had developed over that time a deep and genuine belief in his own invulnerability. He walked toward her. She didn't move. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I think we should have a conversation." "We're having one," she said. He stopped at a comfortable talking distance, the distance of a man who had learned to hold conversations that looked friendly from the outside. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You and Calloway both." "What you think you have," he paused. "It won't hold up the way you're expecting." "Why not?" she said. "Because courts don't run on ledgers kept by dead farmers," he said. His voice was not unkind, which was somehow worse than if it had been. Courts run on documentation filed correctly through proper legal channels. Your father was a decent man, Clara. I'm sorry he's gone. But what he wrote in a book doesn't change what was agreed between us. What was agreed, she said, was $40 against the sale of cattle. On a dated page. Crane looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Walk away from this, he said. I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you that you are a young woman who has a chance at a decent life, and pursuing this will cost you that chance. It will cost Calloway too, and he's done you no harm. You took my father's land, she said. Her voice was quiet. She wasn't performing anger. She didn't need to. You took it with paperwork you produced after he was dead and couldn't contest it, from a family that had a 12-year-old girl as its only remaining member. And you have done the same thing to other families. And I have their records, and I have mine, and I have a federal investigator arriving in 11 days. The certainty in Crane's face shifted, just slightly. Just enough. You're bluffing, he said. I have never bluffed in my life, Clara said. I don't know how. I learned to say exactly what I mean because I grew up without the resources to waste on misdirection. Crane looked at her for a long moment. The confidence was still there. But it was thinner now, stretched across something that might have been, for the first time in 17 years, the beginning of actual concern. This ends badly for everyone, he said. For some of us more than others, she said. She walked past him to the wagon. Her hands were absolutely steady. She did not look back. She was almost to the edge of town when she heard a horse coming up fast behind her. She pulled the wagon to the side on instinct, and the horse drew alongside her, not a threat. She could see that from the rider's posture. It was Billy Marsh, from the ranch, on one of the faster horses, his face carrying the particular color of a young man who had been riding hard with urgent news. Miss Whitmore. He pulled the horse down to a walk beside her wagon. Mr. Calloway sent me. Something's happened. She felt her stomach tighten. Tell me, she said. A man came to the ranch, Billy said. About an hour after you left. Came in a good wagon, had a letter with him. Mr. Calloway read it, and then told me to come find you and bring you back. Who was the man? Didn't say his name. But Dell told me after he left. Billy hesitated. Billy, she said. Tell me. Dell said he recognized the man from the county surveyor's office, Billy said. And the letter he brought was from the county recorder in Billings. Clara gripped the reins. What kind of letter? Billy's jaw was tight with the effort of carrying news he didn't fully understand. Dell said it was about the property records. About the ledger you filed with Briggs. What about it? Dell said Mr. Calloway went very quiet when he read it. And then he said to come find you immediately. Billy looked at her. That's all I know, Miss Whitmore. I promise. She clicked to the horses and moved them faster. She told herself it was fine. She told herself Ethan would have sent for her regardless. Told herself that very quiet could mean a lot of things, and not all of them were bad. She didn't believe herself. She knew what very quiet looked like on Ethan Calloway. She had seen it the first time she told him about her father's land. She had seen it again when Briggs laid out 5 fraudulent claims across the kitchen table. It was the quiet of a man who had just understood the full weight of something and was deciding how to carry it. She drove the wagon back to the ranch at a pace that left Billy Marsh struggling to keep up on horseback, which told her more about her own state of mind than she was comfortable with. Ethan was on the porch. He had a piece of paper in his hand. She set the brake on the wagon and climbed down, and he came down the porch steps to meet her, which he had never done before. He had always waited, always let her come to him. And the fact that he was moving toward her told her everything about the severity of what he was holding. He handed her the letter without preamble. She read it. She read it twice. She looked up at him. They're saying the ledger is a forgery, she said. Yes. Someone filed a formal objection with the county recorder. claiming that my father's ledger was produced after the fact, and that the entries relevant to the Crane transaction were added later in a different hand. Yes, that's not true, she said. I know. The ink, the paper, the handwriting, it all matches. 20 years of entries in the same hand, the same ink, the same... Clara, his voice was not urgent, it was firm, I know. Briggs will know how to answer this. There are methods document examiners, ink analysis that can prove the age of a document. This is a delaying tactic. It's more than that, she said. If they cast doubt on the ledger before the federal investigator arrives. They can cast all the doubt they want, Ethan said. Doubt doesn't hold up against physical evidence and document examination. He paused. But we need to get the ledger to someone who can verify it before the investigator arrives. Today, if possible, she thought quickly. Briggs. He needs to know about this right now. I've already sent George to find him, Ethan said. He'll be here within the hour. She looked at him. He had already sent for Briggs, before she'd even arrived back. He had read the letter, understood the implication, and started moving not in a panic, not with drama, but with the particular decisive calm of a man who had decided what needed to happen and had begun making it happen. She didn't say anything. She handed the letter back. Their fingers touched briefly, not deliberately, just the unavoidable contact of passing a piece of paper between two people standing close together, and she felt it as distinctly as anything she had felt in years. She moved past him toward the porch. I'll make coffee, she said. Briggs will want something when he arrives. Clara. She stopped. She turned. He was looking at her with the unguarded expression she had seen across the kitchen table when Briggs had spread out the 5 claims, the expression he hadn't had time to compose. The one that existed in the space before his careful control reasserted itself. They went after the ledger, he said, because they're afraid of it. If they weren't afraid of it, they'd ignore it. She understood what he was telling her. The attack on the ledger was not evidence of its weakness. It was evidence of its power. She nodded. She went inside. She had the coffee on and the cups laid out by the time George arrived with Briggs 20 minutes later, slightly windblown and considerably energized by what Ethan had told him. Briggs read the objection letter, standing at the kitchen counter. He set it down. He looked at Clara. Do you still have the other documents? He said. The letters your father wrote before he was married. The Billings promissory note. In the trunk, she said. I'll get them. Get everything, Briggs said. I'm going to send all of it to a document examiner I use in Helena. He's testified in federal court twice on document dating. His conclusions are not effectively challenged. He paused. This is actually good, Clara. She stopped in the doorway. How is this good? She said. Because they've now formally asserted that the ledger is a forgery, Briggs said. Which means when the examiner confirms it is not, they have made a false claim to a federal recorder's office. That is not a civil matter. That is a criminal one. The kitchen was very quiet. Then Dell's voice came from the doorway. Dell, who had apparently been listening from the hall with absolutely no apology for it. So they tried to bury her, Dell said, and dug themselves in deeper. That is an accurate summary, Briggs said. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went to get the trunk, every document, every letter, every record her father had ever kept, 12 years of carrying it through 11 rooms, not knowing which piece would matter. All of it would matter now. She brought it out and set it on the kitchen table in front of Harlan Briggs, and she stood back, and she said, Tell me what you need. The document examiner's report arrived on a Thursday morning, 9 days before the federal investigator was due in Red Hollow. Briggs brought it himself. He didn't send it by courier. He rode out from town with it tucked inside his coat, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how important it was before he even opened his mouth. She had the coffee ready. She had learned to read the rhythm of serious things the way they arrived, the pace at which people carried them, the specific quality of silence that preceded important words. Briggs sat down at the kitchen table. He opened the report. He read the summary aloud. Because Clara had asked him to do that, she didn't want to read it herself first, alone, with no one to catch her if it went wrong. The document examiner's conclusion was unambiguous. The ledger was authentic. The ink composition, the paper aging, the pen pressure patterns all consistent with a document created over a span of 20 years, not fabricated recently. The specific entry regarding the Crane transaction showed no evidence of later addition, no variation in ink age, no inconsistency in handwriting pressure that would indicate it had been written at a different time than the surrounding entries. Furthermore, the examiner had compared the handwriting against the letters Clara's father had written before, without marriage, and found to be the work of the same hand. Briggs set the report down. He looked at Clara. He also noted, Briggs said that whoever filed the forgery objection with the county recorder either did not have access to the ledger itself or assumed no one would bother with proper examination. It is his words a remarkably careless accusation, given the quality of the document they were challenging. Clara pressed both hands flat on the table. She breathed. She had known. She had always known. But knowing a true thing and having a professional authority confirm it in writing were two entirely different experiences, and the distance between them, she discovered, was larger than she'd expected. It hit her somewhere underneath her sternum and stayed there, warm and solid, like something that had been cold for a very long time finally coming back to heat. "What does this mean for the forgery claim they filed?" Ethan asked. He was standing at the counter, arms crossed, with the careful stillness he used when he was listening to something important. "It means," Briggs said, "that Prescott filed a false statement with a federal recorder's office. That is prosecutable independently of the land fraud case." He paused. "I have already drafted a complaint. I am filing it the day the federal investigator arrives." "Does Crane know the report came back?" Clara asked. "Not yet. How long until he does?" Briggs considered. "In a town this size. Then we have hours," Clara said. Ethan looked at her. "Hours to do what?" "Hours before he changes his strategy." She stood up. She was thinking quickly now, the way she did when the shape of something had clarified, and she could see the path through it. "Crane is careful. He has been careful for 17 years. The moment he knows the document examination failed, he will start talking to Forsyth, adjusting his position, looking for a way to make the land transfer look less like what it is. He can't undo a recorded deed," Briggs said. "No. But he can start building an explanation for it." She looked at Briggs. "Is there anything we can file today? Anything that puts his current position on record before he has a chance to shift it?" Briggs looked at her with the expression she had seen from him before, the one that said he was revising his assessment upward. "I can file the full complaint this afternoon," he said. "Federal land fraud, multiple counts. It names Crane Prescott," and he paused. "Forsyth. Once that's filed and on record, any statement Crane makes after will be measured against what he was saying before." "Then file it this afternoon," Clara said. Briggs gathered his papers. He was out the door within 20 minutes. Dell appeared in the kitchen doorway almost immediately after, with the expression of a man who had been hovering within earshot and was not remotely apologetic about it. "George says there's a wagon coming up the road," Dell said. "Town wagon." Ethan moved to the window. Clara stayed where she was. "Who is it?" she asked. "Can't tell yet," Dell said. Then a moment later, "It's Forsyth." Gerald Forsyth came through the door without being invited, which told Clara exactly how frightened he was. A man who came to your property and walked through your door uninvited was a man who had stopped performing confidence and started reacting to fear. She had never seen Forsyth without his composure. She had not imagined him capable of losing it. He was losing it now. Not dramatically, he was still a man of practiced social control. But the edges of it were fraying. His color was high. His jaw was set in the particular way of a man who has been rehearsing words and is no longer sure they're the right ones. He looked at Ethan first, then at Clara. "I need to speak with you," he said to Ethan. "Privately. Whatever you have to say," Ethan said, "you can say in front of Clara." Forsyth looked at her. Something moved across his face, not hostility, and not the contempt she had expected. Something more complicated than either. Something that looked, if she read it right, like a man encountering his own shame from a direction he hadn't anticipated. He looked back at Ethan. "I didn't know," he said. The kitchen was very still. "Didn't know what?" Ethan asked. "About the other families." Forsyth's voice had lost its merchant's authority. What was underneath it was rawer than Clara had expected from him. "I knew about the Whitmore land. I knew Crane had obtained it through a debt claim. I assumed, I told myself, it was a legitimate transaction that the family simply hadn't understood. I needed the land, Ethan. The creek access. Without it, my eastern operation was losing water every dry season. I needed it, and Crane had it. He stopped. "You bought it," Ethan said. "For $1. Forsyth looked at the floor. "Yes." $1 is not a purchase price," Ethan said. $1 is an agreement made before the land changed hands. "I know what it looks like." "It looks like exactly what it is," Clara said. Forsyth looked at her. She let him look. She let him see her, not the woman in the torn dress from the market, not the charity case, not the inconvenient complication in his business arrangement. Just herself. Clara Whitmore, 26 years old, standing in a kitchen that was not yet hers, but felt more like home than anything she'd had in 12 years. With her father's name and her father's careful records and 12 years of carrying something heavy about to be set down. "Your wife laughed at my dress," she said, "in front of 40 people. Forsyth's jaw tightened. "I know," he said. "She did it because she knew she could. Because I was someone who couldn't afford to push back." She paused. "Do you know why I couldn't afford to push back?" He didn't answer. "Because your business partner stole my family's land when I was 12 years old," she said. "And left me with a rented room and a sewing kit and a ledger my father kept so carefully that it survived 17 years in a document examiner and a formal forgery accusation." Her voice was level. It did not shake. She had promised herself it would not shake. "That land was mine. My father's work was in that land. His whole life was in that land. And Crane took it with false papers. And you bought it for $1. And I don't think you're an evil man, Mr. Forsyth. But I think you made a choice, and I think you have known for some time that it was the wrong one." The kitchen was absolutely quiet. Forsyth looked at her for a long moment. Then he said to Ethan, "What do I need to do?" Ethan looked at him steadily. "You need to talk to Briggs. Today. You need to give him a full account of your transaction with Crane, every conversation, every document, every agreement. If you cooperate fully with the federal investigation, Briggs believes there is a path that distinguishes between the man who perpetrated the fraud and the man who benefited from it." "And the land?" Forsyth asked. He was looking at Clara. She had thought about this. She had thought about it more than she'd thought about almost anything else in the past 3 weeks. What she actually wanted, what was actually right, what her father would have said about it. "The eastern parcel," she said. "The creek land. That was my father's, and I want it documented as such, and the fraudulent claim removed from the record. I don't need to farm it myself, but I need the record to be right. I need it to say what actually happened." Forsyth nodded slowly. "The creek access," he said. "I still need," she said. "And there are legal ways to arrange water access that don't involve stolen land. Briggs can draft an easement agreement, a fair one. Paid for at a fair price." He looked at her. "You've thought this through," he said. "I've had 12 years, she said. Forsyth left for Briggs's office within the hour. Dell watched him go from the porch, and then came back inside and sat at the kitchen table and said, to no one in particular, "Well, I did not expect that." He was looking for a way out, Clara said. "Men like Forsyth, they make one bad decision, and then they spend years maintaining the weight of it." He was relieved to put it down. You were harder on him than I expected, Ethan said from the doorway. She turned. Was I wrong? She said. No, he said. You were exactly right. He stopped. She waited. I've never seen you like that, he said. The way you talked to him. How did I talk to him? He thought about it for a moment. Like a woman who knows exactly what she's owed and isn't asking permission to collect it. Clara looked at him. Something in her chest had been doing difficult things for weeks now, and she had been managing it with great determination and considerable effort, and she was finding, at this particular moment, that the effort required was increasing in a way that was becoming difficult to maintain. I learned it from watching other people not do it, she said. He held her gaze for a moment, longer than the conversation required. Then, Dell said, from the table, with the tone of a man who was aware of the atmosphere in the room and had decided to interrupt it anyway, somebody should probably tell Billy that things are going our direction. Boy's been wound tight for a week. Ethan looked at Dell. Dell looked back with absolute innocence. I'll tell him, Ethan said. He went out. Clara went back to the stove. Dell poured himself a coffee and said nothing, which was its own kind of commentary. The federal investigator arrived 11 days later on a Tuesday. His name was Arthur Voss, and he was from the Federal Land Commissioner's office in Washington, which meant he had come a considerable distance and intended to be taken seriously. He was a compact man in his 50s with the efficient manner of someone who had spent a career sorting through complicated situations and had developed both skill and impatience in equal measure. He met with Briggs first, then with Clara. The meeting with Clara lasted 3 hours. She laid out everything: the ledger, the letters, the promissory note from Billings, the document examiner's report, the timeline of events from her father's death to Crane's first filing to the present. She did it in order, clearly, without editorializing. She had organized the materials by date and type, which Voss noticed and noted. He asked questions. Good ones, the kind that came from someone who already understood the basic structure of what had happened and was testing the edges of it, looking for inconsistencies, checking whether the account held under pressure. It held. She had been telling the truth for 26 years. She was reasonably good at it. When she was done, Voss looked at the materials arranged on the table in front of him and said, Miss Whitmore, do you understand what you've assembled here? I understand what my father assembled, she said. I just carried it. He looked at her over his reading glasses. You were 12 years old when this began, he said. Yes, and you've maintained these records for 14 years.
In the expectation.
I maintained them because my father kept them, and they were his, she said. The expectation came later. Voss made a note. We will be speaking with Mr. Crane tomorrow, he said, and with Mr. Prescott, who has agreed to a formal interview in the presence of his own counsel. He paused. I would advise you not to speak with either of them directly during this period. I have no desire to, she said. She stood up. She shook his hand. She walked out of Briggs's temporary office and into the main street of Red Hollow, and she stood in the summer heat for a moment and breathed. 14 years. She had been waiting 14 years for someone with authority to sit across a table from her and actually listen. It had taken 3 hours. She found that she was crying. Not dramatically, not the kind of crying that needed attention. The quiet kind, the kind that happens when a very long tension releases all at once and the body needs a moment to adjust to the new shape of things. She turned her face away from the street and let it happen. It was over quickly. She wiped her eyes. She straightened her shoulders. She walked to the wagon. Crane's interview with Voss lasted most of the following day. Clara knew this because Billy Marsh had found reasons to be in town and came back in the evening with the particular energy of a young man who has witnessed something significant and can barely contain it. He told Dell. Dell told Clara. Clara told Ethan. Crane brought Prescott, she said. And Prescott's own lawyer. 3 men walking into an interview together sends a specific message. It sends the message that they've agreed on a story, Ethan said. Yes. But Voss has the deed transfer. He has the document examiner's report. He has Forsyth's full account. She paused. He has the Delaney records. The Delaney records had arrived 4 days earlier. Margaret Holt had driven them out herself, a quiet woman in her 30s with her mother's eyes and a cardboard box of her father's papers that she had kept the same way Clara had kept hers. Through multiple moves and difficult years, because she had learned from her father that records were the only protection a person without money could afford. She and Clara had sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours while Briggs took them through both sets of records together. They had not known each other well before. They knew each other considerably better now. When Margaret left, she had pressed Clara's hand and said, "My father would have been glad to know someone was still fighting." Clara had held that sentence for days. She was holding it now. "How do you feel?" Ethan asked. The question surprised her. He did not often ask direct questions about how she was feeling. He communicated those kinds of inquiries indirectly through coffee left on the table, through the angle of his diction, through showing up in quiet rooms and staying there. She thought about it honestly. Terrified, she said. And ready, which is a strange combination. Not strange, he said. That's what courage feels like. She looked at him. She had been looking at him and looking away from him for 6 weeks, and she was very tired of looking away. "Ethan," she said. "Clara," he said. They were standing in the kitchen, which was where most of the significant things in the past 6 weeks had happened, and the evening light was coming through the window in the long, golden way of summer evenings. And she was aware that something was about to be said between them that would change the particular careful balance they had been maintaining. She didn't say it. And then he said it for her. "When this is done," he said. "When Voss files his report and Briggs closes the case, and you have your father's name restored when all of that is finished." He stopped. He was looking at her with the expression that had no careful composure over it, the one she'd seen in unguarded moments. "I would like you to stay." She waited. "Not as cook and housekeeper," he said. "I think we're both aware it hasn't been only that for some time." "No," she said. "It hasn't. I don't know how to say this kind of thing," he said. "I haven't. I've been a long time alone and I've mostly preferred it. Or I told myself I preferred it, which isn't exactly the same thing." He paused. "You walked into this house and you reorganized the pantry, and you told Dell exactly what you needed without apologizing for needing it, and you sat across from Harlan Briggs and held your ground. And you talked to Forsyth like a woman who knows her own worth. And I—" He stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. "What?" she said. Softly. "I haven't been lonely in 6 weeks," he said. "I've been many other things, worried and angry on your behalf and other things. But not lonely. And I was lonely for 7 years before you arrived, and I'd mostly stopped noticing." He met her eyes directly. "I notice now." Clara stood very still. She thought about what it was to have someone see you, not the dress, not the circumstance, not the difficulty, or the pride or the careful management of being a person without resources in a world that required them. Just you, the person underneath all of it. "I'm not an easy woman," she said. "I have opinions about everything, and I know how things should be done, and I don't keep quiet about either." "I know," he said. "I rearranged your entire pantry without asking. I noticed. And I told your foreman how to manage a new hand before I'd been here 3 days. Dell needed to hear it, Clara." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them looked away. "Ask me properly," she said. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. The almost smile she had catalogued carefully over 6 weeks, that appeared briefly, and vanished, except this time it didn't vanish. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "would you consider staying on at this ranch in a capacity that has nothing to do with biscuits?" "The biscuits stay regardless," she said. "Obviously," he said. She let out a breath that had been in her chest for 6 weeks. "Yes," she said. "I'll consider it." He nodded, with the gravity of a man receiving important information. "Good," he said. He put on his hat and went out to finish the evening chores. Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she started on supper, because the day continued and the men were hungry and life moved forward, but she was smiling in a way that she hadn't smiled in longer than she could remember, and she didn't bother trying to stop it. The formal finding came 6 days later. Briggs brought it, again in person, again with the deliberateness of a man carrying something significant. This time Clara sat down before he started reading. The Federal Land Commissioner's Office, following a formal investigation by Special Investigator Arthur Voss, had determined that the land claim filed by Aldous Crane on the Eastern Creek parcel was fraudulent. The underlying debt instrument had been shown to be materially inconsistent with contemporaneous records. The claim was vacated. The property would be restored to the estate of William Whitmore, with Clara Whitmore as sole surviving heir, pending completion of the proper documentation. Furthermore, the investigation had identified a pattern of fraudulent land transactions in which Aldous Crane and legal counsel Reginald Prescott had participated over a period of 17 years, affecting a minimum of 5 families in 2 counties. The matter had been referred to the Federal Prosecutor's Office for criminal consideration. Gerald Forsyth, having cooperated fully with the investigation and having agreed to remedy the benefits he had received from the fraudulent transaction, including payment of fair market value for the water access easement to be drafted by mutual counsel, had been classified as a cooperative witness rather than a defendant. Briggs finished reading. He set the papers down. He looked at Clara. She looked at the papers. She didn't speak for a moment. Dell, who was in the doorway again, she had stopped being surprised by this, made a sound that was not quite a word but communicated something. Ethan was standing at the counter. He hadn't moved while Briggs read. "Your father's name is restored," Briggs said. "The record will show that he never defaulted on a debt or pledged his land as collateral. The fraudulent claim is expunged. The land is yours." Clara looked up. She stopped, started again. "Can I see the part where it says his name?" Briggs found the page and turned it to face her. She read it. William Amos Whitmore. The land registered in his name. The fraudulent claim against it formally vacated and the record corrected. Her father's name in a federal document, restored to its rightful position. She pressed her hand flat on the table. She breathed. "He was right," she said, quietly, not to anyone in particular. He wrote it all down because he knew the truth was there, and he believed someone would eventually be willing to see it. No one said anything. She was glad of that. She looked at Ethan. He was watching her with that unguarded expression, the one that existed before his composure had a chance to close over it, and what was in it was not pity and not triumph, and not the satisfied righteousness of a man who has won something. It was something much simpler. He was proud of her. Not proud on her behalf. Not proud of what he had done to help her. Proud of her, of the woman who had carried a ledger through 11 rooms for 14 years and refused to let the truth die because she was the only one left to keep it alive. She looked back at the document. She looked at her father's name. And she made herself a quiet promise, not to him exactly, because she didn't believe in the kind of promises made to the dead, but to herself. In his memory, that she would never again let anyone tell her that the mended thread was worth less than the original garment. She went to town the next morning. She drove herself, the way she always did. She knew it would be different. She knew that information moved in Red Hollow the way water moved. It found the low places and filled them, and by morning, the shape of what Voss's report had concluded would have reached most of the people who mattered. It had. Ruth Beckett came out of the laundry when she saw Clara coming and met her in the street and held both her hands and didn't say anything for a long moment, and then said, "Your father would be glad." "Yes," Clara said. "I think he would." Old Thomas from the hardware tipped his hat. 2 women she recognized from the market walked past, and one of them said, with the careful courtesy of a person making a correction, "Good morning, Miss Whitmore." She had never been good morninged by that woman in her life. "Good morning," she said. She walked to Briggs's office and signed the documentation. She walked to the county recorder's office and stood at the counter while the corrected record was entered. She watched the clerk's pen move across the page, adding her father's name back into the column where it belonged, and she kept her face still until the pen lifted and the clerk said, "There it is, Miss," and then she said thank you and turned and walked out. She was halfway to the wagon when she heard her name. She turned. Mrs. Aldean Forsythe was standing outside the dress shop across the street. Clara stopped. Aldean Forsythe was not wearing the silk gloves today. She was wearing her ordinary clothes, the clothes of a woman going about her Tuesday, rather than the costume of a woman performing her social position. She looked smaller in them, more actual. She crossed the street. She stopped in front of Clara. She said, "I owe you an apology." Clara waited. "What I said at the market," Forsythe said. "About the dress, it was cruel. It was intended to be cruel. And I knew when I said it that I was cruel, and I said it anyway because..." She stopped. "There is no because that makes it right." Clara looked at her. She had thought about this moment. Not specifically, she hadn't imagined Aldean Forsythe crossing a street to stand in front of her. But she had thought about what it would be worth, to have someone who had hurt her acknowledge it. She had thought about whether it would matter. "It hurt," Clara said. "Not because I believed you. I knew my own worth before you opened your mouth. It hurt because 40 people heard you, and some of them believed it, and believing cost those people something whether they should believe it or not." Forsythe's jaw tightened. "I know," she said. "I accept your apology," Clara said. "Not because it undoes it, but because the kind of woman I intend to be doesn't carry other people's cruelty any longer than she has to." She picked up her basket. She walked to the wagon. She drove back to the ranch. She was most of the way there when it hit her, the full weight of all of it, settling at once, the way a season changes not gradually, but in a single definitive moment. The land, her father's name, the corrected record. The apology she hadn't expected. The man waiting at the end of the road who had stood beside her through all of it, without once suggesting she couldn't manage it herself. She pulled the wagon to a stop. She sat there for a moment in the summer heat. She thought, "I made it." Not triumphantly, not loudly. Just the quiet recognition of a woman who has been walking a very long road and has finally, without quite knowing it, arrived somewhere worth being. She clicked to the horses. She drove home. She drove home. And when she pulled the wagon into the yard and set the brake and climbed down, Ethan was there, not waiting on the porch in any dramatic fashion, not performing the gesture of a man who had been watching the road. He was coming in from the corrals with his hat pushed back and dust on his boots, the way he looked at the end of any working day, and he saw her face and stopped. He read it the way he read everything, quickly, accurately, without requiring her to explain it. "It's done," she said. He nodded once. Then he said, "Come eat something. You've been in town since morning." That was all. No ceremony, no speech. Just the immediate practical care of a man who understood that the most important thing a person needs after a long battle is not a celebration but a chair and a meal, and someone who is glad they came home. She followed him inside. Dell had apparently taken it upon himself to start supper, which produced food that was edible in the way that all of Dell's cooking was edible, functional, honest, and entirely without artistry. Clara looked at what was on the stove and gently moved him aside and took over. And Dell stepped back with the relief of a man who had done his best and was genuinely glad to be relieved of it. The men ate. The kitchen was loud with the particular noise of a table full of people at the end of a hard day, and Billy Marsh asked twice what had happened in town and got the story in pieces from Dell and George and sat back with an expression of pure, uncomplicated satisfaction that Clara found she needed to look at for a moment because it was exactly the right response to the day. Afterward, when the men had cleared out and the kitchen was quiet, Clara washed the dishes and thought about what came next. What came next was a question she had not let herself ask until now. For 6 weeks, the answer to what comes next had been the case. The ledger, the lawyer, the investigator, the hearing. There had always been the next thing to move toward, and she had moved toward it with every resource she had. Now the next things were different. The land. She owned 30 acres of creek land and had no immediate plan for it. She had a standing arrangement with Ethan Calloway that had begun as employment and had evolved into something considerably less categorized. She had a conversation from 3 days ago that had ended with the word yes and had not been directly revisited. She was thinking about all of this when Ethan came into the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water. He stood at the counter and drank it. He set the glass down. "Are you staying?" he said. She turned from the basin. "You said you'd consider it," he said. "I'm asking if you've considered it." "I have," she said. And she looked at him directly. "I have 30 acres of my own land now. I have resources I didn't have 6 weeks ago. I have options I didn't have." "Yes," he said, "you do. Which means if I stay," she said, "it's because I've chosen to. Not because I need to." He held her gaze. "That's the only reason I'd want you to." She dried her hands on the kitchen cloth. She walked across the kitchen and stood in front of him, close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, and she said, "Then I'm staying." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, just that, just the one gesture, with the particular care of a man who had wanted to do that for longer than he was going to admit, and he said, "Good." And that was how it was decided, not with speeches, not with declarations that borrowed language from somewhere else. With two people standing in a kitchen at the end of a long day, choosing each other with the same quiet certainty that they had brought to every other decision that mattered. The weeks that followed had a different texture to them. Not easier. Exactly, the ranch was still work. The land was still work. And the process of formalizing the legal restoration of her father's property required more paperwork than she had anticipated. Which meant more trips to Briggs, and more signatures, and more careful reading of documents that were not yet in her bones the way her father's ledger was. But different. She moved from the small room she had been given as the housekeeper into a larger one, which happened without anyone making an announcement about it, and without the men remarking on it directly, though Dell's expression when he helped carry her trunk communicated several things without the use of language. She began making decisions about the ranch kitchen with the full authority she had been holding back from using. And the meals improved in ways that the men noticed and mentioned with a particular gratitude who have been fed well for long enough that they can now tell the difference. She started making plans for the creek land. She talked to Margaret Holt about it. They had developed, in the weeks since their shared testimony, the beginning of a real friendship. The kind that forms between people who have been through something significant together and have discovered that they were made of compatible material. Margaret drove out to the ranch on a Saturday, and they walked the eastern parcel together, Clara's land, her father's land, restored, and talked about what it could be. There was good water access. There were 24 acres that could support pasture. There was a strip along the creek that had rich soil and would grow things. "What did your father intend for it?" Margaret asked. "Cattle," Clara said. "He wanted to run a small herd. He always said 30 acres along a creek was enough for a man who knew how to use it." "Do you want cattle?" Clara considered this honestly. "I want the land used for something that would have made him glad. I'll figure out the specifics." Margaret looked at her. "You know, Ethan Calloway has more cattle than he needs pasture for on his current land." Clara looked back at the creek. "Yes," she said. "I know that." "That's a natural conversation to have," Margaret said, with the tone of a woman who was being deliberately tactful. "I'll have it when I'm ready," Clara said. "Of course," Margaret said, and changed the subject, which was what good friends did. The conversation happened 2 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, which was Clara's free time, by the terms she had set on her first day, and which Ethan had respected completely throughout. She found him at the fence of the north pasture, watching his horses with the settled attention he brought to animals, not managing them, Just watching, the way a man does when he genuinely likes what he's looking at. She stood beside him at the fence. She said, "I want to talk about the creek land." "I figured you would eventually," he said. "I've been thinking about a partnership," she said. "A formal one. You run a portion of your herd on the eastern pasture in exchange for a percentage of the earnings. I maintain ownership of the land, and the easement arrangement covers Forsyth's water access. In 5 years, if the arrangement is working, we revisit the terms." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a good business arrangement," he said. "It's meant to be," she said. "I don't want charity, and I don't want to be absorbed into something. I want an arrangement that keeps my father's land productive and generates something I can build on independently. Even if independently gets complicated," he said, "given the other arrangement we've made." She turned to look at him. There was that almost smile present, not vanishing this time. "Business is business," she said, "and the other thing is the other thing. I'm capable of keeping them separate." "I know you are," he said. "That's not what I'm asking." "What are you asking?" He turned from the fence to face her. "I'm asking," he said slowly, "whether a woman who has just recovered her father's land and established her own legal standing and demonstrated to the entire territory that she doesn't need anyone to fight for her." He paused. "Whether that woman has any interest in something more permanent than a business arrangement." Clara looked at him. She thought about what permanent meant. She had spent most of her adult life without anything permanent, without land, without a room that was truly hers, without a person who chose her consistently and deliberately, and without condition. She had learned to be self-sufficient, because self-sufficiency was survival, and she had been good at it, and she was proud of having been good at it. But she had also spent 6 weeks watching a man move through the world with quiet decency and genuine care for the people around him, and she had discovered that self-sufficiency and choosing someone were not opposing things. That you could be fully capable of standing alone and still choose, freely and clearly, not to. "Ethan," she said. "Clara," he said, "are you asking me to marry you?" He didn't look away. "I'm asking if you'd consider it," he said. "I know you have opinions about how things should be done. I know you'll want to think about it in your own time and in your own way. I know you're not a woman who accepts things because they're offered, but because she's decided they're right." He paused. "I'm asking if I am something you'd decide is right." She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about her mother's trunk, now in a room with a locking door on a ranch that felt like home. She thought about her father's ledger, restored to its rightful meaning. She thought about 11 rooms and 14 years, and the particular loneliness of being a person who carries everything alone, because there is no alternative. She thought about alternatives. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, you'll consider it, or yes, you've decided," he said. "Ethan," she said, "I decided 6 weeks ago. I've been waiting for you to catch up." Something happened to his face that she had not seen before, a complete, unguarded openness, the expression of a man who has been careful for so long that the absence of carefulness was almost startling. He laughed. Actually laughed, short and real, the laugh of a man genuinely caught off guard by something delightful. She had never heard him laugh before. She decided immediately that she intended to be the cause of it on a regular basis for the foreseeable future. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a ring, simple gold, with a small stone that caught the light. She stared at it. "You had that ready," she said. "I've had it for 2 weeks," he said. "I was waiting for the right moment." 2 weeks, she said. "I'm a patient man," he said. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She held out her hand. He put it on her finger, with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, carefully, correctly, without fumbling, as though he had been practicing. She suspected he had been practicing. "It fits," she said. "I asked Ruth Beckett what size," he said. Clara stared at him. "You asked Ruth Beckett. She knows everything about everyone in this town," he said, with the tone of a man who had thought this through rationally. It seemed efficient. Clara pressed her lips together. She was not going to laugh. She laughed. It came out of her the way laughter does when it has been held back too long fully, without reservation, the kind that made her press her hand over her mouth for a moment, before giving in to it completely. Ethan watched her with a satisfaction that he didn't bother concealing. She recovered. She wiped her eyes. She looked at the ring on her hand in the late summer light. "Ruth is going to be insufferable about this," she said. "Probably," he agreed. "She'll say she knew from the beginning." "She did know from the beginning," he said. "Most people did. Dell told me in my 3rd week that you were going to see trouble for my peace of mind." He meant it as a compliment. Clara turned to look at him fully. "You talked to Dell about me?" "Dell talks about everything," Ethan said. "The skill is knowing which conversations he initiates and which ones he provokes." "Which was this?" "He told me the morning after you reorganized the pantry that I'd better sort out what I was going to do about the situation before I did something stupid by accident." He paused. He wasn't wrong. Clara shook her head slowly. "I've been working alongside a conspiracy." "A well-meaning one," Ethan said. She looked at the mountains. She looked at the land. She looked at the ring on her finger, her father's land on the other side of the eastern fence, and the man standing beside her who had stood beside her, consistently and without condition, for 2 months and who had, apparently, been talking to Dell about it since week 3. "Ethan," she said. "Yes, I'm glad you walked into that market." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad I heard what I heard," he said. "I'm glad it made me angry enough to do something." "It made you angry? What they said to you?" His voice had gone quiet in the specific way it did when something had reached past his composure. "Yes, it made me angry. A woman standing there holding herself together while people tried to take her apart, that's not something a man sees and walks away from. Not a man worth anything." She didn't say anything for a moment. "Then the coat was too warm." "I know," he said. "I kept it on for 10 minutes anyway." "I know that too," he said. "I was watching." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that open expression, the one without the careful composure over it, and she understood now that this was what he looked like when he trusted someone fully, without the managed distance he kept between himself and most things. She reached up and straightened his collar, the way she had wanted to do for approximately 5 weeks, and said, "We should tell Dell before he finds out from Ruth." "Dell already knows," Ethan said. She dropped her hand. "How does Dell already?" "I told him this morning that I was going to ask you today," Ethan said. He said it was about time and went back to the fence repairs. Clara stared at him. "You told Dell before you told me?" "I told Dell so he wouldn't interrupt," Ethan said with perfect seriousness. "He has a habit of appearing at critical moments." She thought about this. It was, she had to admit, entirely accurate and also entirely Ethan the careful, practical management of a situation before it became unpredictable. He had told Dell the same way she had written the supply list the night before Ethan offered her the job. The same instinct, expressed differently. She was going to be married to a man who thought the way she thought. That was either a very good thing or a very complicated one. Probably both. "Come on," she said. "Let's go tell the men before Billy finds out from someone in town and tries to organize something embarrassing." Ethan fell into step beside her. "Billy would organize something well-intentioned and poorly planned," he said. "Which is its own kind of disaster," she said. "Usually," he said. They walked back toward the house in the long afternoon light, and the sound of the ranch moved around them, the horses, the distant work, the dog coming to investigate and then losing interest and going back to whatever the dog was doing, and Clara felt, with absolute clarity, that this was what home felt like. Not a place, not a building, the specific combination of people and work and belonging that made a piece of ground into a life. The wedding was in September, not a large affair. Clara had no interest in spectacle, and Ethan had even less, and when they had discussed it in the kitchen, over coffee, with the same directness that characterized all of their most important conversations. They had agreed on small and honest and exactly what it was. Ruth Beckett stood with Clara. Dell stood with Ethan, which was fitting and correct, and made Dell visibly uncomfortable in the specific way of a man who is not accustomed to being asked to hold still and dress up, but who would not have been anywhere else. Margaret Holt and her husband came. Billy Marsh wore his good shirt and polished his boots and sat in the front with the expression of a young man at his first wedding who was finding it more affecting than he had anticipated. The preacher was brief. The words were the right ones. When it was done and the preacher had said what needed saying, and Ethan had put his hand over hers in front of everyone, Clara looked out at the small gathering of people who had chosen to be there, who had chosen her, in their various ways, over the course of the summer, and she thought about what it meant to belong to a place. She had lived in Red Hollow her whole life and felt, for most of it, like someone who existed at its edges. Like someone the town tolerated rather than included. And then things had changed, not because she had changed, not because she had become softer or easier or less difficult, but because the truth had finally been said loudly enough that the people who were willing to hear it could not avoid it anymore. She was still the woman in the mended dress. She always would be. She had kept the blue cotton dress, folded carefully in her mother's trunk. She would keep it indefinitely. Not as a reminder of poverty. She was done with poverty, done with the particular grinding weight of it, but as a reminder of what it had taught her. How to read people quickly, how to hold herself together when things pressed from outside. How to know her own worth without requiring anyone else to confirm it. Her father had kept his ledger for the same reason. Records mattered. Truth mattered. The careful preservation of what was real, held against the possibility that someone would someday be willing to look at it. 3 months after the wedding, something happened that Clara had not anticipated. A woman came to the ranch. She arrived on foot, which was unusual, and she was young, 19, perhaps 20, and she was wearing a dress that had been mended so many times in so many places that it was more repair than original fabric. She was carrying a small bundle, and she had the particular expression of a person who has walked a long way and is not entirely sure they will be welcome at the end of it, but has run out of other options. Clara saw her from the kitchen window. She went to the door. The young woman stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "I heard," she said. Her voice was careful, like someone who had learned to be careful with her words. "I heard what you did. About the land. About the false claim." She stopped. "My family. We have a situation that sounds like ours might be the same." Clara looked at her. She looked at the dress, the repins,
different threads, careful stick careful's in places where it had worn through time.
the evidence of a woman who had kept something going with whatever she had available. She looked at the girl's face. She recognized something in it. Not her own face, not exactly, but the expression, the particular combination of pride and exhaustion, and the determination not to show how afraid she was. She had worn that expression herself for 14 years. "Come in," Clara said. "Tell me what you have. Tell me what your family kept." The young woman climbed the porch steps. Clara held the door. She thought about her father writing in his ledger, line by line, date by date, in his careful, deliberate hand, not knowing who would read it or when, but knowing that the truth written down was the truth preserved. She thought about what it meant to be the person who could receive that. She brought the girl to the kitchen table. She put the coffee on. She sat across from her and said, "Start at the beginning." The girl started at the beginning, and Clara listened the way no one had listened to her for 14 years, with full attention, with belief. With the specific respect owed to a person who has carried something true for a long time and finally found someone willing to help them use it. Outside, the September light moved across the ranch, and the horses moved in the corrals, and the mountains held their position above everything the way they always had. And the creek ran along the eastern pasture on land that had a name restored to it, William Amos Whitmore, her father. who had written things down, because he believed that records mattered and people with nothing to hide had every reason to write the truth in permanent ink. He had been right. He had always been right. And his daughter had proven it, not by being rescued, not by being pitied, not by waiting for someone else to decide she deserved justice, but by carrying the truth through 11 rooms and 14 years until she found herself in a position to stand on her own ground and say it clearly in front of everyone who needed to hear it. The old blue dress stayed in the trunk, but everything else, the land, the name, the life that had been taken, and the life that had been built, those were not in the trunk. They were out in the world, working, permanent, and entirely her own. That was the whole story. That was what a torn dress and a careful ledger, and one decent man stepping out of the shadow of a fence post had made possible. Not a rescue, not a fairy tale, but the harder and more lasting thing, the return of what was always true. A woman's worth was never in the cloth that covered her. It was in the courage she carried underneath it, day after day, year after year, until the world was finally ready to see what she had known all along. Clara Whitmore, Clara Calloway now, though she kept both names and used them both and made no apology for it, had always known. And now at last so did everyone else.